Well, the big news, that was one heck of an accomplishment. I mean, their words don't describe how big of an accomplishment that was. My understanding was too on October 7th, essentially the NIST MEP National Director presented you with an award at our TMAC Manufacturing Day for being the first country or first company in the country to actually complete the demonstration of showing you meet all the requirements. Hopefully I didn't misspeak there, but essentially you've met all the requirements and you passed your high level assessment. You've got very little to do, and then you will essentially, once you've completed your one remaining poem atom and through your Delta assessment, you will be 100% for CMMC 2.0 level 2. That has got to feel awesome.
Oh, absolutely. After 2 years of working on this, that was the one fun day to enjoy with that achievement. So much appreciated.
Can you kind of walk us through a little bit about what all you went through?
So we had started back in 2020, so that we were basically on a 2-year journey to accomplish this. We started with, when we go back to 7012 DFARS, recognizing that was enforced starting in 2017. We didn't do an internal assessment till 2019 of that. And I say that openly, and I'm pretty sure most of you listening probably didn't go through one of those either. And if you did, you just shook your head and said, yes, I did it, similar to what we did. But when we took it serious in 2019, knowing that CMMC is coming around the corner, we did decide to do that assessment. That assessment took us 3 months to complete. When we came out of that, we recognized we had a ton of gaps. By the time we got organized, it was like mid-2020 before we formed a team and focused on closing those gaps. And essentially at the time, it was still CMMC 1.0. We set out to achieve a level 3 assessment for CMMC 1.0. As time went on, as you guys know, that evolved to CMMC 2.0, and we adjusted down to level 2 accordingly. But to get there, I think in short, the first thing we started was as we scrubbed the NIST 800-171 documents and the, at the time, assessment guide for CMMC level 1. We used that along with 800-53 to start to build our policies. And that was kind of our approach on deciding on what our standards are going to be and what we're going to live to. That took us a few months. As we scrubbed through it, debated what do we want to do, how do we want to measure ourselves, et cetera. So, but to us, the key thing was policies, establish the policies, which really internally we treated as our standards. Once we got that done, we understood, going back to our 2019 gaps, we married the two together and essentially started to build our poem. That poem had 100+ items on it, so it wasn't a short list to go through. And I guess to keep things in perspective, we're not a large organization. We are US based, although we have customers internationally. Let's see, roughly 100 or so employees, so you kind of get a feel for the size of the company. IT resources in a company that big aren't significant either, so a journey of 2 years wasn't out of the question for us. So once we've completed going back to the policies, we completed the standards, started to focus on our POAM, we started a shift towards solutions and what technical solutions were missing and the implementation of those. And currently, we worked on our procedures and developing the procedures. While we had some very loose procedures, they were not formalized. What people were doing versus what was written down didn't sync up. A lot of re-education and sitting down to review actual procedures versus written down and what's the right way to do it compared to our standards. So as we've gone through that and implemented the solutions that had gaps, we then started to realize that a lot of our procedures no longer align with the new solutions. So a lot of back and forth and tweaking and tuning our procedures in what we decided to live. Accelerating through to roughly mid-2021, we felt we were done. So that took us a good year to implement the gaps that we had as far as solutions go, technology solutions and procedures. At that point, we felt we were ready. In hindsight, we weren't. So keep that in mind. Fortunately for us, the rulemaking around CMMC 1.0 delayed, turned into 2.0. We had, by then, I think the first C3PAO had gotten authorized. We had engaged with Redspin at the time and started having conversations with them on an assessment. As time played out, in hindsight, what really was beneficial to us, it really gave us time to live what we built, whether it was the technology that we implemented or the procedures we built. So we lived those procedures for a good year. And in doing that, we recognized we had gaps here. This didn't work as it should. That allowed us to either tune and reconfigure technology or adjust our processes, and not just internal to IT, but across the company, whether that was onboarding related, hiring practices, termination practices, transfer, job transfers, all of that. So we essentially, I don't want to use the word perfected, but tuned substantially what we had built. And by the time the summer of this year, 2022 came around, we then felt, wow, compared to where we were last year, we're so much better. And right around that time is when the joint surveillance conversation started because of the additional delays. We had already been in the queue with Redspin for an audit. So somewhere in that process, we ended up tapped to be one of the early volunteers to go through that assessment. Just before that, when I say just before that, probably in the May timeframe, we got introduced to TMAC, Darold specifically. And knowing that we had an audit coming or facing, we wanted to engage with Darold and his team to do a pre-assessment. Now that we felt more confident in where we were, we had said to ourselves, let's go through a dry run or a test run. That's where Darold and his team came in. Darold introduced us to DTC and their tool for doing the assessment. And at that point, we dove in. We only had about a 2-month period to go through that. But so in hindsight, as we started it, I want to say we were at a 95 plus confidence level. Probably 2 weeks into that pre-assessment with Darold, tanked pretty quickly. Recognizing that we didn't have this or that. And it mostly came down to, while we were doing the practices, in a lot of cases, they were too informal and not formal enough to where I could have structured evidence of each one of those events or procedures that occurred to be able to demonstrate that we're doing it, more that maturity layer around it. So as we cut trees down, we didn't really advertise it, so to speak. So that kind of opened our eyes to more the audit angle to doing this, rather than just practicing it, but being able to demonstrate that we're actually doing it. So needless to say, that meant a lot of tweaks to our procedures, a lot of effort on our documentation, and specifically the evidence in preparation for the audit, and tuning that. So accelerate through that 2 months, a lot of hard work the last 2 months in stretch. The DoD had reached out to us with, hey, we're ready for the joint assessment with you guys. August 29th is our start date. And then from there, it was a week of hell going through the audit itself. And now that we're on the other side of it, it's a much better conversation. You know, I don't know if I rambled on too much, but
no, I think you hit the spot on the head. And in all fairness, you know, this was a good thing for all parties involved, because yes, you know, we engaged with Aero-Glen, and one of the things that TMAC did was, Aero-Glen's got a really, really good workforce. They've got a really great cyber team and everything. We were able to gel with them really and form one team. And then as we went through and we did this pre-assessment, if we found anything that there was a misunderstanding on, or if things didn't connect with either the quality management system or whatever the case may be, the benefits of us working together was we not only identified the issues, but we fixed them. And then, you know, the intent is, you know, TMAC's intent is if, we'll work with the company just like Aero-Glen or whatever, and we're going to be brutally honest. Yeah, he's right. His confidence level did drop for a while. But, we want to be brutally honest so that you're not surprised when DBCAC and DCMA and the C3PAO get in there. And, the intent is to get you through that audit the first time. And, that's one of our key focuses. Now, DTC has been working with TMAC forever, actually at least the last 3 years. These guys, we've licensed a very high advanced level tools off of them under the EPU platform. And these are second to none. I have looked across the country at trying to figure out how do I get the best tools and the best things to interact with companies. And this is the best I've found. I can't promise you there's not a better one out there, but if there is, I don't know about it. So, I've been using this as a lot of the stuff that we've been doing for NIST and MEP and the like. And, when I say that, I actually interact a lot at the national level at NIST on cyber as well. So, I see a lot of things. So, very good organization. Hey, Zbigniew, can you give us a little bit of an idea? How did it all work out on your outbrief and everything else and the results? What were your results?
So the outbrief, let me give you a brief timeline. So we started the assessment on the 29th of August. It's 5 days, so September 2nd or so we finished. While we had a brief verbal outbrief at the end of that, which gave us an indicative as to where we are, and we felt good about it, but there was nothing quantified. And then it was crickets for a little over a month. We didn't have our formal outbrief with DOD or DBCAC until, I want to say this, a week ago or so, whatever that was, mid of this month. And it was in that session that they gave us the formal results. So going back to your SPRS conversation, we had back in 2021, submitted our scores, and of course, like everyone else, we put them 1 ton, thinking we were great, and we did it. Our score ended up being a 107. And so the way that ends up reflecting in SPRS is we had a basic assessment that we did for ourselves as a self-assessment. The new score that reflected by DBCAC would be a 107, and it'll say next to it a assessment of high. So instead of a basic assessment, you get a high assessment because it was a combination of in-person, it came on site, as well as virtual.
Right, now that is one heck of an accomplishment. Essentially, really what that's saying is DOD's verified that you are a 107.
Yeah.
So for all you high-level primes and tiers out there, Aero-Glen is just an excellent company to work with to provide security for any of the information that you're sharing with them. So, your risk factor of working with Aero-Glen is about as low as it gets.
They're really good.
Go ahead, got a question?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the initial engagement with the C3PO and their expectation of evidence, the level of evidence of which they expected to see, and sort of in detail about how that worked.
Good question. So in preparation for the audit, keep in mind that August 29th was the start date. The first engagement or official letter from the DOD stating the joint surveillance program was about a month prior to. And in that letter, you essentially get a letter that lays out the rough agenda and timeline of what will happen and what's expected between or prior to that. So in that letter, it defines that they want or expect documentation to be submitted roughly 2 weeks prior to your assessment. So it gives them time to ingest that and absorb it in preparation for the audit. And in our case, because it's a joint assessment, you're going to end up having to submit documentation to the DOD through their DOD Safe tool. And then, however, your C3PAO is going to want to receive that. Since they don't have access to DOD Safe, you essentially have to provide that twice. In terms of the depth of the documentation, if you guys are familiar with the 110 practices and ever reviewed the CMMC assessment guide, or for that matter, the ECU tool is very similar structure to that. There's roughly 350 or so definitive objectives within each of those practices. So for example, you'll see in 3.1.1, A through F or something like that. So think in general 350 different objectives that they're looking for to validate whether you do or do not. In our case, we generated roughly 270 different documents to support those. So for every one of those ABCs and for each of those practices, there was, for the most part, a document to support it. And then in terms of the nature of the documents, it was typically a narrative around the specific solution, the controls, the procedures, screenshots of configuration for whatever the system that may be the one that's controlling it. In some cases, depending on what you have, if it's a system-driven practice, we leave the evidence in the system. If it was a manual process that controlled it, we would end up having to generate and maintain control docs that track the changes, updates to it accordingly. So, but in a nutshell, quite a few documents in preparation for this. And that is in addition to each of the respective policies to support the different practices and procedures that support that.
Right now, one of the things I would like to take a second and do, I would like to thank Aero-Glen and all parties involved or whatever, because of TMAC's affiliation with NIST and everything, we were actually permitted to be basically involved in this whole assessment process, which, you know, to us was just actually a priceless gesture. But, you know, as we were being involved in this whole process or whatever the case may be, when we had went through the pre-assessment with Zbigniew and everything else, we literally went through each one of these assessment objectives painfully, one by one, and we reviewed all the evidence, we reviewed everything associated with each one of them, and you know the intent is to make sure everything met standards. And in so doing or whatever else, it was extremely impressive to watch Zbigniew lead the team when he was going through the assessment, because basically every time they asked a question, he could pull up the actual policies and procedures just at a moment's notice, and also pull up the evidence file, and he had very clear evidence. He had a massive evidence file, and it was very well organized, and I can't do anything but take my hat off to the Aero-Glen company for doing such a wonderful job on this assessment, and they were great to work with. Do we have a way to take any questions or whatever, Sheila, from the audience? Okay.
As well as timing, documentation, or evidence.
Yes, I think I understand the question. So I essentially throughout the 2 years played the auditor hat. Tried to, while I was the project manager and focused on managing the overall program and deliveries, I also had to step back and attempt to play that independent, objective, outside view. Sometimes hard to do that when you're deep into it yourself. So from time to time, I would pop out and put the auditor hat on, and for a specific control. In fact, when we were building the evidence documentation, the role that I played was I would ask whoever the admin or system owner was to provide me the evidence and the screenshots of this, and that, whether it was related to a access control issue or a training issue, whatever it could be. And in that way, as I received that, I used that one to build our documentation, but at the same time, test ourselves against all of those objectives to make sure that we satisfied them as I completed the docs. My team hated me for it because I kept peppering them for, no, I need this, I need that, you didn't show this, do we have this? And in hindsight, you know, they didn't understand why I was doing that, because none of them really took the time as we were going through it to go through the 300-page document. So no one really had the big picture of it. The system owners themselves will focus narrowly on what they own, so they didn't get the whole objective. As we finally got through the pre-assessment, And then finally the audit, that one of them actually came back to me and says, now I get what you were doing to us back then, and it makes total sense. Totally support it, and it was a great approach to doing it. But yes, as we went through it, I would on a quarterly basis basically go through each of the controls and grade ourselves on level of completion and whether or not we satisfied that and how we're doing.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, just to add to what you just said, you know, when we actually went through the assessment, both DCMA, DIBCAC, and actually the C3PAO would actually take the individual that was responsible for that particular objective, and they would have them physically walk through exactly what they were doing to demonstrate that, you know, people were exactly following the written procedure that was documented, and, you know, that the evidence was all good and everything. And one of the really big kudos for Aero-Glen was they lived exactly what they said. They had a process, they did exactly what they said, and they had proof that they actually did it. And I guess last of all, it was effective. It did what it was supposed to do. So like if a girl would, you know, one of the office staff would print something out, she would order a print for CUI, she'd have to go over to the printer, she would have to enter her code exactly like what it said. Then the device would, you know, would print the particular items out so that it doesn't sit on the printer. I mean, just as one example. Another example was some of the assessors or whatever else, they might show up 45 minutes or an hour earlier than what they're supposed to, and in the morning super early, go around and check the security of the building or do various different things. They had their ways of verifying that Aero-Glen was living what they said. And Aero-Glen did. They did exactly. They followed their procedures to the letter. And, you know, I'm very complimentary of that.
To that point, maybe I add something that I thought was beneficial. I'm grateful that there actually were delays in the CMMC assessment. So once we built the thing roughly in that 21 time period, we were fortunate enough to live what we built for about a year and gave us the time to tune it, tweak it, but at the same time, as one of the auditors actually mentioned to us, build muscle memory. So when it came time to the assessment, whenever a topic came up around, show me how you do this, or I want to do an over the shoulder on your screen and your configurations, the team who now does it or practices it on a daily basis, for them it was just second nature to be able to pull that up and quickly get to that screen with confidence, knowing that they've done it. And from the auditor's perspective, it basically demonstrated you walk the talk, you're doing what you're doing, and it's embedded in your literally in your hands as you navigate the screens, you know, which as you're going through the audit, essentially build confidence from their side and credibility for us as you go through it.
Do we have another question?
Just real quick, we've got like 2 minutes, but just lessons learned. If you could do it, if you had to start from scratch again, would you engage outside help earlier? Would you go after the documentation earlier? You know, what would accelerate your having to do over things over?
Knowing where we are now in the CMMC model, 2 years ago, a lot of resources didn't exist. We were essentially on our own. Some of the timing or length was because there was limited resources. For those that are starting now, outside resources help is there. Find it, tap into it accordingly. The other, I touched on whatever you build, give yourself ample time to live it, tune it, tweak it, expect that you will have time or room to tweak and will need to tweak to reflect reality, so to speak. The one thing we learned coming out of it that I wish we did differently has got to do with encryption. And as some of you guys know, a lot of the controls touch on FIPS and FIPS 140-2. And while that as a standard may be somewhat dated and there's better encryption capabilities out there that a lot of our tools had, if your systems or technology doesn't have FIPS validated certificates with it, that's something that will come up as an issue, and it did for us. Fortunately, we're able to chase down most of that. We did not address all of that. That's why the 107 versus the 110. But that is something that if I knew or understood that FIPS validated versus FIPS compliant is a difference. While I understood there is a difference, I didn't know how to heart they would take literally the validated versus compliant. So compliant is not sufficient. It must be validated, meaning you need the certs sitting in this, the CRST tool, whatever, I forget the acronym. So make sure you go through that.
Yeah, and I think what Zbigniew, that's about the hardest thing to do out of this whole thing. I wanted to leave you on one comment, and then, then we're going to move on. This is coming. This is coming March 2023, between then and maybe May, June timeframe of 2023. This is not the thing you do over a weekend. This, even though it took Aero-Glen 2 years to do this, if you haven't already started and you're planning to continue to do work in DoD, you're way behind. We're going to talk about 5-day audits here in a little bit, and consequences thereof, but also in meeting CMMC compliance. This isn't something you place an order for in 2 weeks and a month. From now, you're going to be fully compliant and you're going to be able to pass an external audit. You need to engage that help now. Now, one, DTC is a great company, TMAC works with them, MEPs across the nation, go to your local, I know this is a national broadcast, go to your local MEP. If you're in Texas, call me. You'll see my contact information at the end of this presentation, if you could put that up, Cheryl. Even if you're not in Texas, email or call me. Either myself or my team will get you hooked up with the right MEP. But Manufacturing Extension Partnership, it's under the Department of Commerce. It's here to help you do this. And we're very technical. So give us a call, send us an email. Zbigniew, you got any parting words?
The only thing I want to say is, Darold, thanks for all your time and help and partnership in this.
You are very
We're able to pull it
welcome.
off with you.
It's fantastic working with you guys. Now, I just really thank Zbigniew for taking some time out of his day to share this with everybody.